The series opens up on a bright summer day as the Brannock family, consisting of parents Dean and Nora and their adolescent children Carter and Ellie, make their way to Westfield, New Jersey. The family has decided to move to the suburbs in a bid to get away from the hustle-bustle of the city. They are about to go for an open house tour of the 657 Boulevard bungalow in Westfield. This can be their new home if the family likes it, and if they can afford it. Barely a few minutes into the open house tour, the family is instantly smitten by the expensive home. They revel in its various amenities, ranging from a historic dumbwaiter, a small lift intended to carry food, to an in-ground pool. They like the property so much that they overlook several weird things that happen during the tour. While they are downstairs, a strange man watches the family from the second floor without speaking a word. Then, they find one of the neighbors, an elderly woman named Pearl, and her mentally challenged adult brother, Jasper, snooping around the dumbwaiter. It is later revealed that Pearl is the president of the local preservation society, and both she and her brother are extremely obsessed with the home's architecture. In the meantime, Nora runs into an old friend from college, Karen Calhoun, during the tour. Karen is the realtor who is transacting the house and managing its sale. Nora tells her that she has a huge gallery show lined up, and if it sells out, she could finally get her big break. While the two friends are chatting, Dean meets a man with a bow tie while inspecting the second floor. This is the same man who was watching the Bannocks earlier. Dean thinks he might be another one of the potential buyers and doesn't think much of the man. Outside the house, Dean meets with Maureen and Mitch, the neighboring couple who keep watching the house all day long. Overlooking all these little odd things, Dean and Nora put forth an offer for the house as they like it very much. However, the Bannocks' financial situation is not as healthy as it looks from the outside. Dean meets with a bank manager, Steve, who says that their previous bankruptcy raises serious questions of credit risk for the bank. While Dean's income is healthy, it is not enough to secure a jumbo loan of this size. Hence, Dean decides to pull all his savings, stocks, and bonds to make a down payment and reduce the loan. Steve warns him not to get too carried away, but it is quite obvious that Dean is smitten with the place. A few days later, the Bannocks start moving into their new home. As the movers arrive, a mysterious figure watches the house from afar. Inside, Nora feels liberated moving to this new place and hopes it brings peace and better times for her family. The next morning, Ellie hears strange music coming in from the attic's speakers, but it stops when she inspects further. After she leaves, however, a silent static radio signal lingers, indicating someone else is in the house. Downstairs, Dean is shocked when he suddenly finds Jasper in the house so early in the morning. Jasper leaves without any fuss after dropping the newspaper on the floor. A few hours later, the family gets a weird letter from someone called the Watcher in their mailbox. It contains a veiled threat to the Bannock family, asking them not to stay in the house any longer. The Watcher says that the house has a special place in their heart and has been a part of their family heritage for more than 100 years. Furthermore, the letter warns the family not to go ahead with the new renovation work in the basement and kitchen. The Watcher aims violence against Ellie and Carter. Creeped out by this, Nora and Dean immediately go to the police. However, Detective Chamberlain of the Westfield Police Department dismisses the threat and says Westfield is one of the safest towns in America. In his experience, such things often fizzle out and are mostly pranks. However, on Nora's insistence, they send in the letter for DNA analysis, which will take a month to come back. After returning back home, Dean confronts Maureen and Mitchell for picking at the wild arugula that has grown on the Bannocks side of the fence. However, Maureen says that they have been doing this for almost 2 decades and no neighbor has ever complained. Suddenly, she becomes strangely rude to Dean when he fights back. She leaves after giving an ominous warning to Dean that she will be watching what the Bannocks are up to. In the meantime, Nora joins the country club where she occasionally plays tennis with Karen. The realtor too behaves a bit strangely. When Nora talks about all the weird things that have happened recently, Karen replies that they should probably sell the house if they feel threatened. It is revealed that Karen is a divorcee and got the house from her ex-husband Rick along with a lot of his money. Back at the house, Carter takes his pet squirrel Sprinkles to a ride in the dumbwaiter. To his horror, he finds Jasper lurking inside it. Enraged by the continuous breach of their privacy, Dean drags Jasper out of the house and shoves him on the ground. Outside, Pearl explains how the previous owners allowed Jasper to use the dumbwaiter, as he likes playing with it. But Dean warns Jasper and Pearl to never ever step into his house without permission. To spite her, Dean says they will rip the dumbwaiter out along with the trees that line their property. Hearing this, Pearl's tone changes to a low hiss. But before leaving, she too says that she will be watching what the Bannocks are up to. That night, things take a violent turn when someone breaks into the house and kills Carter's pet squirrel, Sprinkles. In the morning, Chamberlain and his cavalry arrive to review the weird incident. While the neighbors watch from afar, Detective Chamberlain dismisses the death of the squirrel as an accident. but increases the frequency of squad cars going into the locality. To prevent further home intrusions, Dean and Nora hire a young security specialist named Dakota to equip the house with new cameras and alarm systems. On his way out, Dakota meets Ellie while she is taking a swim. They flirt and it could possibly blossom into a love affair. Unbeknownst to the two youngsters, Dean is keeping an eye on them from the window above. Unfortunately, all the new security system does not stop a second letter from the Watcher, which arrives the very next day. The letter once again talks about the children in a violent and predatory way. The second letter from the Watcher scares the Bannocks quite a lot. They once again go to Detective Chamberlain and plead with him to investigate Jasper. He turns down their suspicions and instead asks them to list their house for sale to see who would bid. When they reject the idea, he suggests hiring private security, since doing that would cost a lot of money. A good private investigator is the next suggestion. Dean and Nora think it is a good idea. The following day, Dean meets with Theodora Birch, a jazz musician turned investigator at a local diner. She has liver cancer and tells a story of how she came to be obsessed with murders while she was in rehab. That is in fact what saved her from her alcoholism. Dean does not say yes outright, but for the price, her services seem tempting. Later at home, Nora floats a suggestion of selling the house, but Dean does not support the idea. Besides, the renovation in the kitchen and basement is to start soon. But with the dust from the renovation, Carter's asthma might start acting up again. Citing that, Nora says they should move into a motel for the time being. Dean agrees and the family gets a room in a motel nearby. However, Dean goes back to the house to sleep so that he can let the workers in the next day. That night, as soon as he lies down, the doorbell rings. He goes out only to find no one nearby. Unbeknownst to him, someone is standing in the shadows nearby and watching him. Soon afterwards, he hears music coming from upstairs just as Ellie did a few weeks ago. He goes up and inspects the room and finds that it is actually coming from the speaker in the walls. Behind his back, when the camera turns the other way, there is someone behind him, watching on. On the other hand, at the motel, Nora gets a phone call in the middle of the night. The person on the other end just breathes and does not say anything. She immediately calls Dean with this information, and he suggests she ask the receptionist of the motel to try that number again. In a surprising twist, when the receptionist does so, a phone rings inside the Brannock residence. This all but confirms that the Watcher is indeed inside their house. However, none of the Brannock family members are aware of it. The next day, Karen reveals to Nora that she went through all the offers on the house before her family decided to buy it. Surprisingly, the only other offer was a lowball one, someone trying to flip the house. But because it was from an LLC, a private limited company, there are no names on the documents. She once again suggests Nora sell the house, but with a hefty discount to what they bought it at. Nora does not like the idea, as that amount of loss would be detrimental to their financial situation. Elsewhere, Dean meets with Theodora, who gives him the number for the previous occupant of the house, Andrew Pierce. He is a talent agent and she asks Dean to set up a meeting. He then reveals that Nora just wants to leave the house behind and go back to the city. However, Theodora warns him that not knowing who is behind it would leave him unsettled for the rest of his life. Back at home, Nora mentions her newfound encouragement to get through this horrible situation. She gets support from Dean and they decide not to sell the house for the time being. To their relief, Dakota volunteers to watch over the house during nighttime. The following day, Dean meets with Andrew, the previous owner of the house. The guy looks like he has been through a lot, and narrates his tragic stay at the house. But before he can begin his story, he asks Dean not to waste any more time and just leave the house as soon as possible. Dean's wife, Rosie, was a cellist, and once they had a son, Caleb, they moved out to the suburbs for a change. The move affected Rosie and she rediscovered her force in life. However, everything changed when they met Mitch and Maureen. Rosie started to go through the same anxious episodes that Dean has gone through in the house. Meanwhile, Andrew was forced into leaving Caleb with the next-door couple. One day, Caleb said to his father that he saw a bunch of old people in Maureen and Mitch's living room wearing red robes and standing in a circle. They had sacrificed a newborn baby and were drinking its blood. Andrew then learned of a 3-month-old baby who went missing from a nearby community, confirming his theory. And then, the letters started coming. While Maureen and Mitch stared at his house all day long, the cops would not believe Andrew's theory and refused to take any action. The letters started getting more violent by the day and drove him mad. One day, Rosie saw Maureen come out through tunnels inside his own house and drink blood from Caleb's hand when he cut himself. After that, Andrew and his family left the house for good. But soon enough, Rosie committed suicide. Dean is conflicted about whether to believe Andrew or not. His accounts seem like a crazy story, but considering everything weird that has happened to him recently, Andrew's story might have a hint of truth. Meanwhile, Dakota and Ellie make out in the pool, while the former is on watch duty for the night. The next morning, Pearl notices workers outside the Bannock household and calls Maureen, who goes over to confront Dean. However, Dean rudely talks back to her and says he can do whatever he wants in the house. He also jokes about Maureen contracting melanoma from excessive sunlight, something that gets her emotional. However, things go from bad to worse for Dean. When he reaches work later that day, he learns that someone else has been promoted instead of him. He is furious, but his boss tells him that his focus has been off of work in the last 4 years. Later that night, Dean tries to get some sleep after a horrible day and hears gunshots, but he is so tired that he cannot tell whether he really heard the shots or it was simply a dream. The next day, Nora and the kids return to the house. Seconds later, they hear ambulances outside and Nora and Dean rush to inspect. In a horrifying twist, Mitchell and Maureen are both dead. The former killed himself first and then murdered his wife. Deranged from the grief, their son blames Dean for insulting his mother and causing the suicide. That night, everyone except Dean goes back to the motel. Late at night, the alarm blares and Dean goes to the window to investigate. When he looks out, he sees a smiling Jasper standing outside, looking straight at him. Jasper then walks back to his house without saying a word. A few days later, Theodora and Dean discuss the possible suspects and who could be the watcher. Maureen and Mitch are off the list now that they are dead. On the other hand, Theodora finds compelling evidence against Andrew when she digs deeper. He had previously accused the principal of his son's school of harassing his son, Caleb, on a field trip. But the incident was dismissed instantly as Caleb didn't even go on the alleged trip. Another suspect, Jasper, has lived with his family his entire life. After school, he bagged groceries at the supermarket for almost 23 years. Through some keen detective work, Theodora discovers that Jasper was once a functioning member of society. But after an unknown event in 1995, he became mentally sheltered and spent decades in behavioral therapy as a result. Meanwhile, at the country club, Karen warns Nora of how relationships become stale once there is no physical intimacy between the partners. Nora mentions problems at home like Dean's changing attitude toward Ellie and his growing short temper. In response, Karen casually stipulates that he is having an affair. However, Nora does not take this seriously as she knows Karen has no filter and says anything that is in her mind. Meanwhile, Karen is still insistent that Nora and the family move out. She even takes Nora to see another house in the area, a newer one with no history. Meanwhile, at home, the renovation work is going on in full swing, and Dean comes back home from work. He goes up to Ellie's room where she is hiding Dakota in the closet. Fortunately, she deals with Dean by the door side and does not allow him to come indoors. When Dean comes back down, he is surprised to meet a strange man who introduces himself as John, the building inspector. He says everything is okay with the house while making a sandwich for himself. When they sit down and talk more, everything gets even more weird. John starts talking about the fourth turn, a time when a crisis will throw the world into chaos and something big will happen in the shape of a revolt or war. He then talks about Ellie and mentions that she is in a relationship with Dakota. John mentions how his own daughter was the school prostitute and how they dealt with her. Abruptly standing up, he announces that he will be back in a few days after the building is finished. But soon afterwards he says he will never see Dean again. Then, after suggesting Dean take his family to a nearby Lutheran church, John leaves the house. Dean is creeped out by this interaction and says to the contractor that he does not want to deal with John again. Confused, the contractor says there is no inspector named John, making Dean wonder whom he just talked to. Hours later, Nora comes to the house and takes Karen's advice about regular intercourse. She tries to initiate an intercourse and Dean reciprocates, but her mood is spoiled when Dean leaves in the middle because of a phone call. She then takes the kids to the motel once again, until the renovation is finished. The next day at office, Dean gets a call from Theodora, who says she has got her hands on a box of files that was never made public and is related to the history of his house. And thus, the two meet and begin uncovering the tale of John Graff, the same man that Dean met earlier in the day, disguised as the building inspector. John was a normal, retired military personnel. He was a devout Christian, and then later took up accounting. His mother, Gladys, inherited some money and bought him a house, the 657 Boulevard in the suburbs. His son, Dale, was a straight-A student and an athlete. On the other hand, John's daughter, Patricia, was somewhat of a promiscuous girl in his eyes, and his wife, Helen, was indifferent to the whole thing. Unfortunately, one day, John got fired from his job and everything went downhill. As he oversaw the family finances, he started to go to the bank every day and withdrew small amounts from his mother's account. John never disclosed to his family that he had lost his job and kept up appearances. When he got back from the bank one day, he saw a letter from the watcher in the mail. It talked about him pretending to go to his job and his daughter's affair with someone. He then kept getting more and more letters as days passed by. On Halloween later that year, He noticed Patricia's teacher from school dancing close to her. It seemed to him that his daughter was having an affair with a teacher. While listening to John's story, Dean desperately asks himself if he is turning into John Graff. Theodora then reveals that John killed all members of his family and disappeared. Before leaving, he put on music, the same one that Dean hears in the house, and left the bodies to rot for 14 days. Unfortunately, on the 14th day, Jasper saw the bodies laying in the living room and went into shock. Ever since, he has not spoken a word to anyone. After the incident, the police discovered blood-filled bottles in the basement. The reports confirmed the blood belonged to each of John's family members. However, John was never seen again. Theodora adds that Patricia's teacher was also found dead, but was shot with a different gun. When she reveals that John used to go to a nearby Lutheran church, Dean remembers his interaction with the building inspector. He then tells Theodora that he met John earlier in the day. After a few days, the family moves back in the house with upgraded security cameras. Nora is relieved that everything is behind them. However, her paranoia returns when she finds yet another letter from the Watcher in the mail. A few days later, when Dean and Nora confront Darren Dunn, Karen's boss, he replies that they had no idea about the house's history before selling it to the Branicks. When Dean threatens with a legal suit, Darren says a lawsuit would be detrimental to the family itself, and not his agency. All transactions were carried out to the letter of the law, and there is no scope for snooping around. Desperate not to let the relationship between her friends and her boss sour, Karen tries to intervene, but the Branicks ignore her efforts. On the other hand, Dean had ordered the yearbook of Westfield High School for the year 1995 from the police department. In it, he finds the names of the Graff family members. He then immediately leaves the office and postpones all his work meetings to pursue the evidence more closely. Once he reaches home, Dean goes over all the information he has and wonders why Chamberlain gave him all the evidence, as these expose the misdealing of the police department and the town's dirty secrets. Meanwhile, Nora once again asks Dean for some intimate time, but he is not into it. Following this, Theodora, Dean, and Nora further discuss the case. This is the first time he mentions John Graff in front of Nora, which upsets her as she does not like her husband keeping secrets. Moreover, he is falling back into the pattern where he neglects work, which led them to be bankrupt a few years ago. From their conversation, it becomes obvious that Dean is struggling with the issue and suggests they sell the house. Enraged, Nora says he is backing off his own word, but Theodora calms them down. Instead, she suggests a theory that Dakota might be the Watcher. She then reveals that according to her research, Dakota's screen name for online gaming is the Watcher. He also has a motive since he wants to sell products for his business. They then use a hacker to intercept data from his laptop. Furthermore, Dean and Nora settle whatever differences they have temporarily, as Dean says the issue has become about his mental peace and not money. He proposes that they search Ellie's phone and go through her chats with Dakota. Later, when Dean discovers intimate photos of Ellie and Dakota on his daughter's phone, he becomes visibly angry. Ellie is outraged at having her privacy breached, but her parents ground her in the room. When Dakota visits the next morning to install new cameras, Dean physically attacks him. After witnessing this through her window, Ellie phones the police, indicting her own father. The cops arrive afterwards, and Dean along with Dakota are taken to the police station. Soon after, Dakota's mother also arrives there, and the teenager completely breaks down in front of her. Fortunately for Dakota, the cops refuse to charge him as both he and Ellie are adults. However, he voluntarily gives Chamberlain his DNA sample and answers all the questions they ask. Overlooking all this debacle, Detective Chamberlain starts viewing the Branicks as ungrateful people who misuse his trust. Later, angry with her father, Ellie posts a video online calling him a racist, tarnishing his public image. Elsewhere, Nora meets Karen at the country club and they once again discuss selling the house. That night, Nora returns home and finds a letter in the mail containing a flash drive. Just then, Dean's boss also receives the flash drive at work. Both flash drives contain an incriminating video of Dean sleeping at home, while a young girl undresses at his bedside. Confused and with no recollection of the girl in the bedroom, Dean leaves work and runs into Dakota, who admits to placing the camera in the bedroom and sending the flash drives. However, the youngster feels bad for Dean after realizing how harmful the video will be for his career. Dean also apologizes to Dakota for outing him in front of his mother. When Dean comes back home from work, Nora confronts him with the video and throws him out of the house, threatening to file for divorce. Needing a place to stay, Dean stays at the motel for the night. However, in the final scene, things get even more strange. Dean goes back to his house to secretly watch over for intruders. However, he sees Mitch and Maureen return home in a taxi. They look completely healthy and alive despite the fact that he had seen them being taken to the hospital. and declared dead only a few weeks ago. Subscribe for more videos like this, turn on the notification, and leave 1,000 likes or 100 comments if you'd like us to continue part 2. Thank you.